Hello all, it's Loki, and today we're going to be covering monster morale and how to run encounters. It's a tricky subject, but it's one that many of you guys in the Lair have voted for on my recent poll. I want to say thanks to everybody who's been so supportive of the channel and liking the content. If you'd like to get involved and support a new, growing TTRPG channel, all you gotta do is subscribe. Thanks guys. When I run encounters, I consider the types of monsters that I'm running. Is the monster powerful? Are they confident in their abilities? Or are they a pack of runts like goblins or kobolds who accidentally stumbled into the party? I think some dungeon masters have this assumption that when their parties fight against enemies, that they should fight until either the party is dead or the monster is dead. I feel like this is quite unappealing to me. Obviously you do want your players to be able to kill the monster and the bad guys, but it doesn't have to happen all the time, or even most of the time, for that matter. The challenge rating system for Dungeons & Dragons isn't perfect when it comes to balancing encounters, but relatively speaking it's the best and only thing that we really have. It does, however, give the assumption that the party and the monsters will use their full might on one another. And it gives the Dungeon Master this complex where they have to try and use their best abilities and basically what we would call Nova the party in order to win, using the best spells, the best magic, the best abilities, and whatever else in order to come out on top. I mean, that's cool and all, but it doesn't really feel very compelling if every single time you're fighting an ancient dragon, they use their breath attack straight away on the party and knock most of the party unconscious. The reality is, you can throw easier encounters at your party as well as more difficult ones, as long as you're aware of what the challenge rating, it actually is and how you should be thinking about it. I think there have been times in the past where I've rolled for the amount of goblins that the party would face, and I would roll really well, maybe like a 16 on a 3d6. That's a very dangerous encounter for a low-level party, but I actually really like that. With a lot more enemies, the party feels like they're fighting hordes or swarms of enemies, and if they win, it'll end up being quite heroic. I can represent the goblins a little bit more organically, because I have no fear that the encounter won't be challenging. I can have, goblins taunting the party with their actions, throwing mud and stones at them. There's a lot more I can do that I wouldn't normally do if it's like 8 goblins versus 4 PCs. If I want the encounter to be challenging, I'm going to have to use swords, spears, and weapons. Anytime a goblin in my campaign takes damage and somehow survives a blow, because goblins don't have a lot of HP, they'll flee on their following turn. Obviously, this is quite a basic way of using morale, but it's a pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy, right? It's pretty simple. Anytime a creature reaches like 25% of their HP, they retreat, unless they think that they're genuinely going to be able to flip the fight, or they've got no chance at fleeing. Obviously, if a monster's been backed into the corner, it's likely not going to flee, but it might surrender, right? That's something to consider. This is unless you're running monsters that lack self-preservation. A lot of my undead are minus drones, which is very unlike most of my other monsters. They will fight to the bitter end. This makes them a very dangerous foe. A party could be fighting and losing against a large group of goblins, have one good round where the party maybe slay a handful of them, and that would force the rest of the goblins to run away. It doesn't matter how well the party tackles my undead, the party will either have to flee or kill them all, destroy them all. The other way I do morale, and it's a little bit more complex, but not by too much, is to roll whenever the monster's morale is put into question. I do this when players use their actions to intimidate, when a player character performs a feat that is considered significant enough to shake their morale, the leader of the monsters is slain or knocked unconscious, or when a player rolls a nasty crit. And by nasty crit, I mean they roll a crit and they roll really good on the damage, right? I typically give each monster type their own kind of morale bonus, and if it's like a group of monsters, they will all share kind of like a morale score, right? So the encounter basically just has a morale score, unless it's like a bunch of goblins and a troll. Maybe the troll would have their own, and the goblins would have their own, right? And rather than having a DC that sets, that is set, that forces all of the monsters to flee, I look at the result as more of a way of like understanding the morale of the individual or the group of the enemies. Consider it like degrees of success and failure, right? If I roll a 15 for the Minotaur, he's feeling confident, he's taunting the party. But if I roll a 5 for the Minotaur's going to start panicking, you know, in character, striking more ferociously, maybe, you know, shaking or kind of pulling back more defensively. You know, there's a lot of things you can definitely do that. Maybe targeting people who've got less armor. If my Minotaur rolls a natural 20, I'm likely to give that Minotaur inspiration, you know, because they're feeling so confident that they're more likely to succeed. I know some of you guys might be against that, but in my system, that's how inspiration is a little bit more loosey-goosey. And if I ever cover how I actually run D&D, how I run my games, that'll obviously be included. For groups of enemies, a high roll means that the group will stay together. A low roll could mean that a handful of the group will flee, but the rest will stay. If I was to roll a 5 for a large group of goblins, it's likely that I'd have probably half of the remaining goblins flee on their following turn. And fleeing doesn't mean that they'll all just dash away or disengage away. Some of them may still take offensive, aggressive actions in order to gain their freedom and stay alive, but they'll be a lot less organized and instead be more focused on themselves rather than like their group as a whole. It'll be a much more like emotional response from the goblins rather than like trying to actually use their very low intelligence and wisdom scores to make good decisions. Some of you may be thinking of commenting about how if your monsters flee, it won't be a challenging combat. And you might be right, you know, sometimes it won't be as challenging as you would have liked. But interestingly enough, most players don't really mind if some of your encounters are a little bit more difficult or a little bit easier than they would normally be. Having a small patrol of orcs attack the party on a road is a nice segue to what could be an interesting side quest involving an orc camp that's only half a mile away. Having one of those orcs attempt to flee on the second round creates an interesting circumstance where the party now needs to react and take that orc out before they manage to flee and cause further threat for the party. Sure, they're going to easily defeat 3 orc scouts, right? That's no question. But are they going to be able to bring down the scout who's now trying to call for help? Right? If you're worried about your encounter being too easy, just throw a few more enemies in there, or raise their hit points slightly to add an additional buffer. Sometimes if I feel like an encounter won't be fun or challenging enough, I just throw another enemy in there. Maybe like a well-armored brigand who leads the bandits. He might not really have much more going on, but if you know anything about challenge rating, maybe it'll be like a thug to a bandit. Bandits are like CR18, so they're very easy to defeat, whereas a thug has like multi-attack, has a bit like an extra like 10 hit points, a bit of a higher AC as well, I believe. You know, it's not that much more challenging, but it's just a little bit of extra meat to make the combat a little bit more thrilling. You know, morale is a really great tool, you know, for making your dungeons more dynamic too. If I have 2 caves, each with goblins in, if the party attacks the first cave and manages to force some of the goblins to flee, those goblins are likely to run into the next cave, inform the goblins there that there are adventurers coming, and they'll likely set up an ambush for the party or prepare for the party in some way, shape or form. Rather than focusing on developing big set piece fights, I tend to keep my dungeons quite a bit more dynamic, where I can kind of shift and change my plans on the fly based on what the party does. Sure, it might mean more work for the party later on, but if they were a bit more careful when they went into that first cave and a bit more cunning, none of those goblins, or you know, less of those goblins would have been able to escape and reinforce the next line. If you teach your players that their decisions have weight, they are more likely to consider strategies and tactics in order to best your monsters. It's not been the longest video today, but definitely one I've been very happy to cover. I think dynamic morale is something I'd like to see a lot more at TTRPG tables. So tell me what you guys thought of the video today, and if you actually had any interesting encounters as a dungeon master or a player where morale has or should have been used to make the combat a little bit more interesting. I'll see you guys next time on Loki's Lair. Until then.